Hi, and welcome back to my channel, Learning Biology with Dr. Vanessa. In today's video, we are going to take a closer look at the skeletal system, looking at different types of bone formation and healing of fractures. If you haven't already watched my other video on the introduction to the skeletal system, now is a good time to stop this video and watch that other video first so that you have a better idea of how the skeletal system is laid out. However, if you don't have enough time to do that, I'm going to put a little bit of background information into this video so that you're not completely lost if you're just watching this video as is. In order to understand bone formation, we need to understand the different types of cells that work in the bone. We have a group of cells that come from bone cell lineage, and then another cell that comes from white blood cell lineage. In the bone cell lineage, we have the osteogenic cell. The osteogenic cell is basically the stem cell that gives rise to most other bone cell types. This cell is capable of undergoing mitosis. They multiply continuously, making more of themselves. So these stem cells will continue to multiply, making more of themselves. They can then differentiate into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are cells that form bone, or bone-forming cells. These cells are not capable of mitosis. So once a cell has differentiated into an osteoblast, it can no longer undergo mitosis, meaning when those cells die, they're gone, and new ones have to come from these osteogenic cells. Now, if you looked at the picture of bone that we talked about in a previous video or in your class, these osteogenic cells are found in the endosteum as well as in central canals. They then can turn into osteoblasts, and osteoblasts will be the cells that are going to be putting down bone, okay? They deposit down the bone matrix, and they are going to continue to make it. As they continue to make the bone matrix, they are going to eventually develop into osteocytes. Now, osteocytes are osteoblasts that have become trapped in the matrix that they deposited, and now they're going to live in cavities, which are referred to as lacuna. These cells cannot move anymore. These osteocytes cannot move anymore. They're trapped within the matrix, but they live in this little space called a lacuna, and there are little canals that are formed around them, referred to as canaliculi. Now, the canaliculi is where their processes extend out, and this also allows them to talk to other cells. While they are there in this area, they're going to contribute to the homeostatic maintenance of both bone density as well as blood concentrations of calcium and phosphate ions. So they are responsible for keeping the matrix, the bone, etc. happy. And then we have the osteoclasts over here. The osteoclasts are formed from white blood cells, so they don't come from bone cell lineage. They actually come from white blood cells. And these osteoclasts are bone dissolving cells. They are found on the surface of bone, and they are capable of what is called resorption, where they release their acidic contents and then they resorb the bone. So they're going to break down that extracellular matrix of bone. So we have osteoblasts that are going to build up the bone and osteoclasts that are going to break down bone. Let's talk just a little bit more about these cells and what they specifically do while looking at these pictures here. These pictures are done with a scanning electron microscope. I really like pictures done with a scanning electron microscope because not only can you see really fine details, but the pictures are done in sequence, in a series, slice after slice after slice after slice, and then they're put together so that you get this 3D image. Now, they're not ever done in color, they're done in black and white, and then an artist can go back in and color the picture, and so you can really see what the cell looks like. So you can see the osteoblast in here, the osteocyte right here, deposited in the bone matrix. And then you can see the osteoclast here. Now this last picture, I believe, is misnamed because this does not look like a scanning electron micrograph as you see in the other ones. It looks very flat. It also is like a purpley pink, so it looks like it's stained with hematoxylin and eosin. I could be wrong, but it does not look like a scanning electron micrograph. So here we have our osteoblast. Remember again that our osteoblasts are our bone-forming cells. They actually synthesize and secrete collagen fibers as well as other organic components that are needed to build the extracellular matrix of osseous tissue. Remember, osseous is another word for bone. Osteoblasts also initiate calcification. They surround themselves with extracellular matrix and eventually they become trapped in their secretions where they then become osteocytes. A good thing to understand or note, put into your brain, is that when you see cells that end in blast, B-L-A-S-T, that part of their name means that they're going to secrete some sort of extracellular matrix, okay? So osteoblasts form bone. Once they become trapped in that extracellular matrix, they become osteocytes. Like I mentioned before, you can see the osteocyte here, and it is surrounded by a hardened, calcified extracellular matrix versus the osteoblast that is here. So the osteoblasts are either on the very exterior of the bone or the very interior of the bone, and they are forming bone. As they get trapped in that matrix, they become an osteocyte. So these are mature bone cells, just like osteoblasts. They cannot divide, they cannot undergo mitosis, and they are actually the most numerous cells that we find in bone tissue. They are responsible for maintaining the bone tissue with its daily metabolism, which includes things like the exchange of nutrients, waste in the blood. Remember, bone is a living tissue. Even though it is hardened, there is still blood running through the bone. These cells are receiving nutrients. They're making waste that have to go out in the blood as well. So they're getting nice, fresh arterial blood with oxygen and nutrients. They're putting out their waste into the venous blood to be taken back to the heart and for those wastes to be removed from the body. Okay? So another type of ending in the cell that we also see a lot as we study different types of cells and different organs is CYTE or site. And that site, when you see that, that is going to mean that that cell is responsible for maintaining the tissue. Okay, so we have our blast building up the tissue. We have our site that is going to be maintaining the tissue. And then finally, we have our osteoclasts. Now, osteoclasts are actually a really large cell. And as I mentioned before, they are derived from white blood cells. Specifically, the white blood cell that they are derived from are monocytes. As many as about 50 monocytes actually fuse together in order to form an osteoclast. Now, if you remember anything about monocytes, you may not have learned about those yet. Monocytes are a type of white blood cell that can eat things, or they phagocytize, right? So cell eating. So these white blood cells are responsible for eating cellular debris of cells that have died, or recognizing bacteria that may come into the body, things of that nature. One of their main jobs is to eat things. Because of this, monocytes have a lot of lysosomes within them. Remember, that is a cellular organelle that has a lot of digestive enzymes in it. So every cell has organelles, but some cells have more of a type of organelle than others depending on their specialty. Well, monocytes have a lot of lysosomes because they have the need for a lot of digestive enzymes when they eat things to break those things down. Well, osteoclasts are derived from about 50 or so of these monocytes that all converge together. So osteoclasts actually really have a lot of lysosomes within them. And so you can see the osteoclast here. And what happens is where the osteoclast meets the bone, it has this edge, which is referred to as a ruffled border, because it has like a folding look where it touches the bone. And from that area is where the osteoclast is going to release these enzymes from the lysosome. And these enzymes and acids, when they're released, are going to cause the bone to dissolve. And while the bone is dissolving, it's going to release things like calcium, phosphorus back into the bloodstream, okay? So this can be released by the osteoclasts breaking down the bone. So the osteoclasts break down that bone by the releasing of those enzymes, acidicness, and this is termed resorption. So you heard me mention that before, and resorption is when that matrix is being broken down by the osteoclast. Now, this is a very normal process, and throughout our whole lives, there is going to be some sort of building up bone with the osteoblasts and breaking down bone with the osteoclast. So that's going to be a lifelong. In this video, we're going to talk about that in relation to bone formation, bone remodeling, bone healing. In another video that I'm going to make, we'll talk more about the physiology of why this would happen in maintenance of minerals that are in the blood. One other thing to note is that when we see cells with the ending clast, C-L-A-S-T, that means that this type of cell is going to break down extracellular matrix. So one more time for recap: osteoblasts build bone, osteocytes are mature osteoblasts that are now trapped in the extracellular matrix, and osteoclasts break down bone. Bone development. So bone development, as I had mentioned in my other video, is the development of bone, just like it sounds. But it is termed ossification. So ossification is bone tissue formation, and it occurs in 4 different situations. 1, in the formation of bone that happens in an embryo. 2, the growth of bones until adulthood. 3, the remodeling of bone. And 4, the repair of fractures. When we think about bone and bone growth and bone as a living tissue, we probably really only think about those first 2. We don't really think about the remodeling of bone or the repair of fractures. But ossification or bone tissue formation is going to occur in some form or fashion all throughout your life. Obviously, in the embryo, in childhood, etc., it's going to be much more dramatic, but it is a process that's going to occur. So our osteoblasts and our osteoclasts are always going to be working in the bone. If we talk about ossification or bone tissue formation, there are actually 2 types of ossification. The first type is referred to as intramembranous ossification, and this is the ossification that produces the flat bones of the skull and most of the clavicle or collarbone. The other type of ossification is referred to as endochondral ossification. This is the process by which most of the bones of the body develop: the vertebrae, ribs, scapula, pelvis, bones of limbs, etc. We are going to take a closer look at how both of these types of ossifications happen and what's the difference between them, because obviously they are very different from one another. First, let's take a look at intramembranous ossification. This is the bone formation of the flat bones of the skull and the clavicle. If you think about these types of bones, they are not very thick. This type of bone formation occurs when there is a condensation of mesenchyme into a soft sheet. Here I have a picture of what mesenchyme looks like. What is mesenchyme? Mesenchyme is a connective tissue. It is very loosely organized, as we can see here. The cells are very spread apart. The cells in mesenchyme tissue are referred to as mesenchymal cells. And it is very loosely organized, and we find this tissue type in embryos. It is actually an embryonic tissue type, undifferentiated, from which connective and skeletal tissues can be made. So in order for intramembranous ossification to occur, we need a sheet of this mesenchyme tissue that has condensed in the area. So again, these bones are not very thick. They're pretty thin bones, so think about that compared to other bones we'll talk about with a different type of bone formation. So in intramembranous ossification, we're going to have that condensation of the mesenchyme into a soft sheet. Eventually, there's going to be this formation of an ossification center. And what we'll also see during this development is that blood capillaries are going to start to permeate into the area in order to deliver nutrients to those cells. The next thing that's going to occur in intramembranous ossification is that there is going to be calcification. So those osteogenic cells, which were the stem cells, are going to differentiate into osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are going to start laying down the matrix of bone, and as they do so, they're going to become trapped within the matrix and turn into osteocytes. So we'll start to see some osteocytes in lacuna, and then developing that canaliculi, those little canals, to be able to talk to one another. So that matrix is going to calcify in the middle as bone forms. And then we have the formation of the trabeculae, which is that spongy bone, that airy middle portion of the bone to make bone a little bit lighter. So we see that honeycomb formation that is going to occur. The blood vessels are going to intertwine more in there, and they're going to continue to form as the mineral of bone is going to be deposited in that extracellular matrix. And again, that is going to create that spongy bone within the middle portion of the bone. So we can see there's spongy bone, and then there is compact bone as well. Finally, the surface of bone is going to be filled in with the deposits of the extracellular matrix by those osteoblasts, forming a nice layer of compact bone. And then inside we can see that spongy bone. Again, remember, these bones are not very thick. You can see they're very thin compared to the other bones we're going to talk about. And so this bone again was formed on a mesenchyme tissue. And now we're at the point where we now have compact bone that has been formed and the spongy bone tissue that we see in the middle. At this point, the periosteum has also been formed on the outer layer, that connective tissue that's going to be where the osteoblasts are going to be forming bone, because they're going to be derived from those osteogenic cells. So the osteogenic cells are going to hang out in this area, giving rise to more osteoblasts so that they can continue to deposit more bone within there. In this area here, if we were to zoom in, this is where you would see the osteocytes that are now stuck within the compact bone. There would also be osteocytes within the spongy bone as well. Endochondral ossification is the other type of bone formation. This is the ossification by which most of the bones of the body develop. It begins about the 6th week of fetal development, and this process continues on into a person's 20s. We just finished talking about intramembranous ossification, which occurred directly on a sheet of mesenchyme tissue. Endochondral ossification, however, begins on a pre-existing model that is composed of hyaline cartilage. let's talk about how this process begins and then how this process can actually continue on into a person's 20s. In endochondral ossification, we start with the development of the cartilage model. Now, this hyaline cartilage develops on mesenchyme. So mesenchyme tissue is actually the precursor to this, but instead of bone being developed straight from that mesenchyme tissue, that mesenchyme tissue is going to differentiate into hyaline cartilage, forming this model of bone, and then from this cartilage model, the bone will be formed. Now you can notice this the hyaline cartilage actually takes the formation of a bone where there's going to be the proximal epiphysis, the distal epiphysis, and then the diaphysis that is in the middle. Just like we saw in intramembranous ossification, we also have the development of the Ossification Center right in the middle of the bone. As this initial cartilage model continues to grow, the cells in the mid-region are going to increase in size or undergo hypertrophy. This is going to stimulate the surrounding extracellular matrix to start to calcify. So you can see here there's going to be some calcification that is going to occur around these cells that have gotten bigger. As development continues, there's going to be a nutrient artery that is going to penetrate through the periosteum, that outer layer, into the middle portion of the bone. Now, as this happens, we initially had the cells in the periosteum that were differentiating into chondroblasts. Chondroblasts lay down cartilage, and when this nutrient artery comes in through the periosteum, it is going to stimulate those cells to now form osteoblasts rather than chondroblasts. So now we're going to have osteoblasts that are going to start to lay down the extracellular matrix of bone. There is also going to be the primary ossification center formation, where bone is also going to be laid down in that middle area, taking over those areas that cartilage had been initially. As the primary ossification center continues to develop, osteoclasts will work in there too and break down some of the bone. And as we can see here, this is going to give rise to this middle area where red bone marrow will be found, where blood formation and blood cell formation can take place within the middle of those long bones. Eventually, that red bone marrow will turn into mostly yellow bone marrow as you age. Eventually, the epiphyseal arteries will enter into the epiphyseal portion of the bone. This then forms the secondary ossification center. This is going to be very similar to what we saw in the primary ossification center, where bone formation is going to continue by osteoblasts laying down the extracellular matrix. In this case, though, instead of hollowing out the bone, we'll see spongy bone that develops in the middle, while compact bone will stay on the outside. And then finally, we'll see the formation of the articular cartilage. This will cover both ends of the bone, and this is going to give the bone some protection when bone touches against bone, so that there is some protection of the bone, that they're not rubbing each other directly, that they're rubbing the articular cartilage instead. And we also see the formation of the epiphyseal plate. Now, the epiphyseal plate will be the only area where cartilage still remains in the bone. As you can see here, we have spongy bone, we have compact bone, but then we still have the epiphyseal plate where there is still hyaline cartilage. This is going to be where the bone can grow in length. And we'll see this on both ends of the epiphysis, even though only one end is shown here. The other end will look exactly the same, where it has this epiphyseal plate. This is where bone is going to be able to grow in length. Now, in an adult, okay, once you've reached about your 20s or so, this epiphyseal plate gets all covered with bone so that there's no more cartilage here anymore, and growth in length can no longer occur in the bone, and instead of being referred to as an epiphyseal plate, it is then referred to as an epiphyseal line. If we zoom in and take a closer look at the epiphyseal plate, okay, this is going to, they're actually showing it to you upside down. So here's the epiphyseal side, here's the diaphyseal side, okay, so the epiphyseal side and the diaphyseal side. So this is showing you what the epiphyseal plate looks like blown up in proportion. And again, this is only going to be seen in children that are growing. This is what allows bone to grow in length. And so there's different zones here. The zone of resting cartilage. These cells are not responsible for the function in bone growth. That's why it is called resting cartilage. They are going to basically anchor this epiphyseal plate to the epiphysis of the bone. So they're just kind of holding things in place. Then you see the zone of proliferating cartilage. That proliferating term should give that away, that these cells are going to be actively working. So the chondrocytes in this area, chondrocytes are cartilage cells. They are going to be secreting extracellular matrix. They're going to be dividing to replace cells that may have died. And so this area is going to be able to be growing. The cartilage is actually growing in this area. As we move down, we get into the zone of hypertrophic cartilage. And this is going to be where the chondrocytes are maturing. So you can see how they're smaller in the zone of proliferating, but then as we get into the zone of hypertrophic cartilage, hypertrophic, they are getting bigger. Finally, we have the zone of calcified cartilage, and this is going to be where the chondrocytes are mostly dying in this area, and then the osteoclasts are going to help dissolve that calcified cartilage, and the osteoblasts are going to start laying down the bone to eventually we're getting into the area where the bone is forming. And so this is going to happen throughout life, basically where more cartilage is being made to lengthen this area, eventually developing into bone, more cartilage is being laid, eventually developing into more bone, until there comes a point where this whole area gets calcified over in adulthood, and then this no longer occurs, so bone will no longer grow in length at that point. Let's talk about the healing of fractures, because in the healing of fractures, we're going to have the work of both the osteoblast and the osteoclast in here, as well as the healing goes on. So what happens? You break a bone, okay? Remember, bone is a living tissue, so if you break a bone, that bone is going to bleed because you're going to break through blood vessels that are feeding into that bone tissue. And so when you break a bone, the bone is going to bleed. And so one of the first things that is going to happen is that you're going to have a blood clot or hematoma formation. And this is going to clot in that area. Obviously, if the fracture is very great, you are going to have to get a cast, and so the healing of the fracture would then occur within the cast itself. If it is very, very great, then there may be surgery and pins, etc. involved. But these are the steps that the bone is going to go through as it heals. So we get that blood clot formation, and that's going to kind of hold all those areas of tissue together. Then you have what is called a soft callus formation, where collagen is going to be deposited and fibrocartilage is going to help form this soft callus. So it's basically holding everything together with a very soft tissue callus in the area that originally had the blood clot formation. And then there's a hard callus formation, and this is where that soft callus had initially been made, again, over the initial blood clot, and this is where is going to be where the osteoblasts are going to start to lay down the extracellular matrix of bone, and then it's going to get hard, okay? At this point, when they take an x-ray of the bone, they're going to see that hard callus formation and that the bone is essentially healed to the point where it can start to be used. So this is where the cast would come off at this point. Now, what's going to happen is you're going to have these protrusions of the bone around that area that healed. And so now the bone is going to have to start to be used because it hasn't been able to be used while it was in the cast. Then it comes off, and what's going to happen is as the bone gets used and as we put different stresses on that bone remodeling is going to occur. Now, bone remodeling occurs because of the stresses that are put on the bone, and it involves both osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So osteoclasts are going to help start to break down the bone, and osteoblasts are going to build up the bone depending on where the stresses are happening on that bone. So eventually this hard callus will go away as bone remodeling occurs, and then the bone will go back to normal as it is used. But in order for bone remodeling to occur, the bone has to be used because bone remodeling happens, again, based on the stresses that are put on bone. So if the bone doesn't get moved, then the bone remodeling isn't going to happen. So this happens, bone remodeling will happen then as the bone is used and as we're putting different stresses, and osteoclasts help to break down that bone and osteoblasts build up that bone so that there's it starts to remodel to the way it's being used, and there's not so much stress on that bone. Thank you so much for watching my video. I really hope that this video helped you to understand the difference between intramembranous and endochondral ossification, as well as the healing of fractures. My main goal in bringing you these videos is to take really difficult topics and make them easy to understand. If you like the content of my channel, please make sure that you subscribe, click on the notification bell so that you never miss out on a new video. And as always, please share my channel with others that you think may benefit from this information. If you have any questions or comments, please make sure that you put them down below and I'll answer them as best I can. Thanks for watching.